For the last decade, every time someone asked how to make Windows faster for gaming, the answer was always the same. Go into Task Manager, kill every background process you can find, disable your antivirus, turn off Xbox Game Bar, uninstall anything you installed last Tuesday, and maybe you'll claw back a couple of frames.
It was a ritual, it was annoying, and it was a sign that Microsoft had absolutely no idea that the people buying gaming hardware actually wanted to play games on it, rather than manage a small enterprise software deployment just to get a stable frame rate.
Which is why when Microsoft announced that Windows 11 was getting a dedicated game mode at the OS level, not an app sitting on top of Windows, but an actual system-level performance mode that could prioritize game processes and throttle background services automatically, people got excited.
And I mean actually excited, not just tech press excited. So, obviously, we had to test it.
And before you ask, yes, I know game mode has technically existed in Windows since 2017, but that version was basically a checkbox in settings that did almost nothing measurable.
What we're talking about now is a completely rebuilt implementation that Microsoft has been quietly rolling out as part of the latest Windows 11 updates, with a backend that is fundamentally different from whatever that old toggle was pretending to do. The new version hooks directly into the scheduler. It can detect when a game is running and dynamically shift CPU and GPU priority in real time. And it supposedly suppresses the Windows Update service from doing its absolute favorite thing of deciding to run a full background update at the exact moment you are mid-raid. So, let's go through what actually happens when you turn it on. First thing, and this will not surprise anyone who has spent time with Windows in the last few years, finding the setting is not intuitive. It is not in the gaming section of settings, where you might reasonably expect it to be, at least not the new version. You have to go into System, then Display, and then scroll down further than you would think is necessary to find a panel called Advanced Graphics Settings, which is where the new scheduler priority controls live. Why is it there? Because it is Microsoft, and they have never met a setting they could not put somewhere deeply counterintuitive. Once you find it, though, it is a straightforward toggle. Hardware-accelerated GPU scheduling needs to be on, and then the new game mode option appears underneath it. Flip them both, restart, and you are supposedly running a leaner system when a game launches. So I fired up a few titles, and here is where I want to be honest with you, rather than just telling you what you want to hear. The experience of using Windows with the new game mode on feels different. I want to be careful with that word, because different is not the same as better, but there is a subjective quality to the smoothness of certain games that felt improved in a way that raw frame count alone does not capture. Specifically in open-world titles where you are streaming assets constantly, the stuttering that used to hit every few minutes when Windows decided to do something in the background was noticeably less frequent. Not gone, less frequent. Which is actually meaningful if you have ever been in a tense section of a game and had Windows decide that was a great moment to phone home. Now, let's talk about what the lab's testing found, because this is where things get complicated. We ran a set of standardized benchmarks across 3 titles at 1080p and 1440p, with game mode on versus game mode off, on a mid-range system running a modern processor paired with a current generation mid-tier GPU and 16 gigabytes of RAM. The results were, to put it generously, mixed. In our first title, a well-optimized first-person shooter with good PC implementation, we saw an average frame rate improvement of about 3% with game mode on. 3%. That is within the margin of error for dynamic frequency scaling between runs, so we ran it again. Still 3%. Consistent, but marginal. Not the kind of number that justifies excitement. In our second title, an open-world RPG that is notoriously heavy on CPU usage during traversal, game mode actually made things slightly worse. Average frame rate dropped by about 2%, and minimum frame rate, which is really what determines whether a game feels smooth, dropped by 4%. We were not expecting that. We ran it 3 times to make sure. Same result each time.
The theory we landed on is that the new scheduler is being a bit too aggressive about deprioritizing certain background processes that the game actually needs to communicate with, specifically shader compilation services that this particular title uses continuously during play. So the mode is helpful when it can correctly identify what the game needs, and harmful when it gets that identification wrong.
And right now, it gets it wrong more than Microsoft would probably like to admit.
Third title, a competitive multiplayer game with a very tight and well-optimized engine, basically no difference.
The kind of game that is already squeezing everything it can out of your hardware and is not leaving much room for an OS-level intervention to improve things. Flat result, which is actually the best-case scenario here, because flat is better than negative. And making matters worse, we ran into a handful of stability quirks during testing that are worth flagging. Twice during our open world benchmarks, the game lost its full-screen focus and snapped back to windowed mode for no apparent reason. Once, the game bar overlay stopped rendering correctly after about 40 minutes of play and had to be dismissed and reopened. These are not catastrophic failures, but they are the kind of rough edges that remind you this is still very much a work in progress, rather than a polished shipping feature. Microsoft has form for releasing things in this state, and then either iterating them into something genuinely good, or quietly abandoning them while hoping nobody notices. The history of features in this space suggests we should not assume which of those outcomes we are heading toward. Okay, so what is the honest verdict here? Game mode in its current form is not a reason to restart your machine, and not a reason to go adjusting your settings tonight expecting a transformation. The marginal frame rate gains in the best case, the marginal losses in the worst case, and the occasional stability issues add up to a feature that is not ready to be the thing that pulls someone away from using a third-party tool that actually works. And right now, if you are a serious PC gamer managing background processes for performance, there are dedicated tools that do this more effectively than what Microsoft has shipped here. But here is the part where I think the conversation gets more interesting than just whether the current version is good, because I actually think it is not. The fact that Microsoft is building this at the OS level rather than as an app layer is the important part. An app sitting on top of Windows, which is what most existing optimization tools are, can request priority, but it cannot guarantee it. A system-level implementation can make those guarantees. The architecture here is correct, even if the current execution is not. And the reason that matters is that as game engines become more complex, and as the gap between console optimization and PC optimization continues to be a problem that Microsoft and developers are both incentivized to close, having an OS that can actively cooperate with a running game, rather than just getting out of the way, is actually the right foundation to be building on. It is just not there yet. The comparison to Valve's work on Linux compatibility is worth making, because that is the last time we saw an infrastructure investment in PC gaming actually change what was possible, not just marginally improve it. Game mode is Microsoft's version of that kind of investment, and it is currently about as useful as Proton was in its first month, which is to say technically interesting, and practically not something you should be basing your gaming setup around. Give it a year, maybe 2, and if Microsoft keeps iterating rather than abandoning it, there is a real chance this becomes something worth talking about seriously. For now, though, if you came here hoping to hear that flipping a toggle in settings was going to unlock a meaningful improvement in your gaming performance, I am sorry, because that is not where we landed. What we found is a feature that works in narrow circumstances, underperforms in others, has some stability issues that need addressing, and represents a direction that is promising, even if the current destination is not yet worth the trip. Turn it on if you want to experiment, do not expect miracles, and keep an eye on what the next few updates do with it. That is probably the most honest thing I can tell you. If you have been testing it yourself and getting different results, drop them in the comments, because at this point, I want to know if we are missing something.